Hey everybody, I'm Francesca Maximé, and welcome to this July edition of Inside Out with Natasha and Francesca. And we are joined today by two very special additional guests, one of whom you're familiar with, Lynn Min, a psychotherapist here in New York, and Dr. Dana Collins, who is the president of the New York Association of Black Psychologists. And just want to welcome you all, and of course, my co-host, Dr. Natasha Stovall, as we're here today on this steamy New York July day.
Truly. And yeah, thank you to everyone for joining us. And thank you so much to Dana and Lynn for joining us today for what is going to be a great conversation about joy and resistance and why it's so important to understand cultural products in a deeper way and not just in an appropriative and a way that just makes them less important and less meaningful than they truly are.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, when we were talking about sort of doing this show, part of it was we talk a lot about trauma or pathology, and we talk a lot about what is wrong or what isn't right. And as this, show is sort of geared toward white or light skin privileged, sort of therapists, or at least in a very real way, interrogating whiteness, as Natasha has written so extensively about, and how to sort of bring in whiteness on the couch, meaning how does this sort of system show up internally in therapists and our clients in the therapeutic setting, and also, what can we do about it, and how are there different ways of healing and working in a therapeutic way for different populations. And so part of this conversation is about sort of the creativity, the joy, the spirituality piece that may be overlooked or maybe not really thought of properly when it comes to different populations, particularly populations of color. So maybe just opening with that, and maybe inviting our guests to sort of bring in a little bit of what we're talking about as it pertains to spirituality, creativity, and healing. Lynn or Dana, take it away.
Yeah, who would like to start? Dana, why don't you go first? Because I'm curious about some of the things that we talked about at the beginning before the show started. And I think that would be a good lead in to sort of where our conversation is going.
Sure. So one of the things we talked about was sort of there's a lot of the ground we want to cover today. And so we were sort of talking about how to best introduce things, what the best way to make things flow was. And we definitely do want to be talking about this piece around cultural appropriation at the same time. And I think this sort of relates to something you mentioned, Francesca, like not spending too much time on the problem or defining the problem. So trying to kind of find a balance between talking about the problem, but then talking about these things that are good, these things that we do to sort of heal ourselves, to celebrate ourselves. And one thing I do want us to talk about is understanding sort of where the sort of arts and cultural practices come from that get not only appropriated, but commodified and capitalized on. I think if we really understand like the meaning behind those things and where they come from, what they're rooted in, we bring like a deeper understanding to what cultural appropriation does and how it can be harmful. So those are some of the things that I'm thinking about.
Can we define, Lynn, perhaps cultural appropriation? I think that's something you've spent a little time sort of looking at specifically.
Yeah. Well, cultural appropriation. Actually, before we get into that, maybe it's clear I think the organic story of how we got to talk about this is just really important. So after that talk with Brian and Francesca that I had, there was a wrap up, good job, guys. Everything went well. And, and Brian did this thing where like at the last 3 seconds, he was like, yay. yay. And there was body movement. There was a vocalization, not really a song and a dance, but like a little song and a dance, like yoo-hoo, and it so lifted my spirits from the depth. And I just thought, we need this. We need more of that. What's that? Can we put some words to that? And then I was thinking through joy and how it's expressed through music and art and creative expressions, and how that can be such a tool for standing in solidarity and connecting people together. And then which came up for me was, but it could be taken the wrong way. And so I was explaining to one of my friends and also to Brian, I used to go to LaGuardia High School, and I was a voice major. I was one of 2 Asian people in a sea of beautiful Black voices. And I always felt really small. And Black voice, Black soul, having that soul, especially my gospel choir, I remember just feeling like that's the goal, right? Like that is it. So for me, it was a compliment to when other people said, you're like that Asian girl with the Black voice. It's like, yes. But then when I brought it to my friend, I was like, this is what we're going to talk about. And this is how she said, Lynn, don't go on live and be that Asian girl who's like, I got this Black soul. Like, don't do that. Right. And so I had to take a step back, and I was like, yeah, that's not what I want to do. And I needed to put words to that. What is that about? I got so excited. And then I was like, ooh, like, and that, I had to listen to my resistance and kind of go deeper. And that's where my, study into cultural appropriation, what really is this about? What's really the offense? What's the fear? And how can we overcome that so that we can really share in that joy? And so, so I looked it up, I Googled it, cultural appropriation, the unacknowledged or inappropriate adoption of the customs, practices, ideas by one of the people of society, by members of another, and typically more dominant people of society. And I think it took me time to realize that, because for me, the dominant culture was the Black culture when I was growing up in a sea of Black, right? And so that's why it didn't hit me. And so I'm also coming on to this, like, I never thought of that as being the non-dominant, like, and so this is a paradigm shift for me as well, and a learning experience.
It's so interesting to hear you say that, because again, I think we often think monolithically, even though we know better, but it's hard not to, right? And so the intersections within the intersections, the layers within the layers, right? And how is it that even though, you are self-identified as a Korean American immigrant and therapist, that there's also in your mind this sort of internalization of, well, the majority here, the dominant piece here is actually the Black experience, and I'm not part of that, and I want a piece of that, but how do I not co-opt that in a way that is disingenuous, I guess, or exploitative?
Or it's also like, why is it offensive? I want to be like y'all. Like, I'm saying y'all are great, like why, so it's like, I can't say one or the other. And it's like, ooh, okay, so how do I then learn and kind of take this, okay, teach me, I want to learn. What is this about? Why is this offensive? And studying deep into it, and even having that pre-conversation, which I always love, the pre-conversation before the conversation. It helps me feel like, it helps me give direction to, like, what am I going to process now? Where am I going? And it really went into, oh, okay, I get it. And why do I get it? Because I think there are some shared experiences that color, the way Koreans, as me, as a minority also, or a minority, but, express art, and why the deeper subconscious reasons why, the Black soul is so appealing to me in music.
I want to jump in here, and then I want to toss it to read. I want to read something really quick, speaking to your point, and then I'm going to decenter myself, let Dana talk, and Natasha take over. But this is a piece from Healing Resistance, the book by Kazuhaga, and it was a little excerpt that kind of speaks to what you're talking about. And he's a Kingian nonviolence instructor and meditation teacher. And it says, take freedom songs. During the civil rights movement, people did not sing freedom songs just to kill time. It was not a hobby. It was not karaoke night. Singing was a core part of the strategy to keep people unified and their spirits uplifted, to help them maintain their commitment to that cause. During the hardest moments of the movement, people would sing. They sang in churches, they sang while facing fire hoses, and they sang in jail. They used songs as training before the march, as weapons during the demonstrations, and as medicine when they were locked up. Freedom songs kept people committed. And I have heard many elders tell stories about how they would not have made it through the movement if not for those songs. Singing kept them alive. And as John Lewis lies in state in the nation's capital right now, I think it's important to kind of remember the ways in which this is alive for us right now. So, Dana, what are your reflections here?
Yeah, so, I first want to just address something that Lynn started off with, and that was, I want to appreciate your openness and non-defensiveness, because this is another thing we were talking about in the beginning. Talking about this in different forms of racism really can make people very defensive and want to shut down. And when that happens, there's not really a lot of room for movement or change. But I think because you are willing to sit with the discomfort a little bit and look at it, you are able to move forward. And that's huge. Not everybody is able to do that. So I just want to express appreciation for that, and also hope that others can listen and be open non-defensively. But yeah, Francesca, I remember you sending that to us and reading it and really thinking that it was just a really powerful comment on, or maybe even sort of summary about what we're talking about here. And one of the words that was used was medicine, like this was a healing thing. It wasn't just, for entertainment. There was something about it that brought joy, but that wasn't the main thing. These songs were used to get people through a really, really difficult time where it might have been really easy to give up. But I think what these songs did is they not only brought people together, which is a really important cultural value, this communalism, this togetherness, this reliance, this interdependence. And those are actually all traditional African cultural values. But it was also a way of communicating or reminding people why they were doing this, why they were fighting, why they were going on, and what the benefits would be. So it was so much more than just a song to, as I said, pass the time or be entertained. It was healing. It was unifying. It was a reminder. So it was a really powerful thing. And actually a lot of more modern African and African American music really has its roots there, and the civil rights movement. But even before then, there was the songs that were the songs that African slaves and then later African Americans sang. And within those, there was sort of a recognition that singing, using the voice, expels some energy, and that in order to heal trauma, in order to process difficult feelings, that the body has to be involved. So it's really a complex issue, and it's I think really interesting to dig deeper into what these songs and these other practices mean.
I'm thinking as you're speaking, Dana, that part of what you're getting at and that I'm hearing is that the history of African descended people in North America is completely a history of resistance. And that resistance is both expressed sort of like strategically through action, but also through people's use of, African rooted cultural practices. And those have always been recognized as resistance by the sort of white, first the sort of slavocracy, but then ultimately sort of in the wider white culture. I mean, I was remembering, some of the history while you were talking of how when, Africans who were first generation, brought as slaves, as chattel to North America, they brought drumming, and
Mm-hmm.
that drumming was immediately recognized by the slavers, the slave owners, these, as resistance, because it was ways people would communicate and hold on to culture and hold on to humanity
Yes.
and communicate, and also strategically communicating with each other, being a way to like kind of what's going on with you, how can we keep in touch, how can we continue to be connected to each other and connected to ourselves and to our culture.
Mm-hmm.
And the whites in control knew what was happening, and when they shut that down, people then took advantage of like being forced into Christianity and giving up their own religious practices by creating sort of a hybrid, and then using that music as a way to communicate and a way to
Yes.
hold on to humanity. And so like and then that was recognized as a problem
Yes.
because, the white plantation owners recognized that this was a way people were talking, but they were sort of stuck because they were like, well, we're trying to make them Christian, but
Mm-hmm.
now now they have developed a way to resist with it, and so, African descended people have invented and sustained resistance to white supremacy from the very beginning of the founding of America, obviously. And cultural products and practices have been used from the beginning as a way to do that.
Yes.
And because we don't learn this history, people like Lynn, who are very much interested in it's interesting to me how the people are who are non-African descended people recognize the power of it, and they recognize the resistance of it, and they're both attracted and afraid depending on where they sit. And and other cultures have their own histories of resistance, but it's not something that's often held on to when they immigrate here. I mean, every culture has a history here of resistance against oppressors. Like it's not, but in North America, it's really only held by African descended people, and very consciously and kind of strategically. And
Mm-hmm.
so someone like Lynn, who's like in this milieu where she is like kind of steeped in Black culture, you feel the power, you feel you want to be part of it. And then, but in some ways you're completely cut off from the history of it
Mm.
because you don't get that education. And so the appropriation turns into something that's much more culturally appropriate for you as a member of this sort of capitalistic society, which is like, oh, give it to
Mm.
me. I want it. Like, how do I have this? And also a teenager, guess what? You want to fit in. You want to be part of it. You want
Right.
to
That's
like,
very much part of the rules of
and
assimilation in this society.
I also would just point out that like, I'm curious, Lynn, like, did you get accused of appropriation from your peers? Or was it only later because I think that's another way that people can kind of understand better, like if what they're doing is a problem. Is it tribute or is it appropriation? Is like talking to the people around you who represent the cultural tradition and like, is this like, am I offending you right now? I mean, I'm not sure if that's the best way, but
Oh,
it is one way,
yes.
or are they like, go ahead, you're doing fine. Like, I'm okay with this. Like, you're not making me uncomfortable. I appreciate this tribute. I appreciate your homage, like whatever, let me tell you more about, I don't know. I don't have that answer, but I think it certainly, like there's a way that communication can help us with this. That's my thought.
Absolutely. I think what's true is the times were really different then. First of all, it was high school. So it wasn't like, let me tell you about the history. Like there was not a lot of that.
Right.
It was, and also I didn't outright, I think because also of the subconscious nature of like what I was taught, I wasn't really like, here I am. And like, this is what I'm trying to be. Like that wasn't the case. Right. It was very subtle. If anything, I was taught blend in by being part of wallpaper. Right.
Mm.
So even that
Mhm.
desire of like, wow, like that really, like their singing really resonates. It's a very internal desire. Which is, and Asians are kind of taught, like, don't wish to be anybody else. Right. So I disown that part. Only after high school, I realized, oh, I really wanted to be Black in some ways. Right.
Mhm.
Um, So that wasn't a part of the conversation. And there was no need for people to be like, that's inappropriate. Cause, I really was the quiet, silent-ish one.
Mm.
It was really easy for me to for people to just take me around because I blend in anywhere. And that was my survival technique in high school. Right.
Dana,
And
well, go ahead and finish your thought. I'm sorry. I'm curious
No,
though what
it's
Dana.
okay.
Well, I'm curious what Dana would have to say if, for example, to Natasha's point, when is tribute appropriate and when is appropriation inappropriate, and how do you know the difference? And what does a white-bodied person or a person who might be co-opting or using or enjoying or whatnot, what are the things that we can do in terms of that dynamic to make sure that we can check or ask or see if it's okay? I think that that's kind of the core of the question, the sort of crux of that.
Yeah. Well, I think Lynn is speaking to something really interesting, and it sort of points to the fact that there are different reasons that people take on things that are not from their culture. A lot of times it's because they find it entertaining, or they want to profit from it. But it sounds like in Lynn's case, it was really about you are one of very few Asian Americans in this high school full of Black students. And, high school is a time where you really do want to fit in. I mean, that's a developmental thing. So, it sounds like in some ways it wasn't about taking something from someone. It was just being a part of something. It was being a part of something. But to the question about whether it's a tribute or something else, I think people really need to do some self-reflection about what they're doing, why they're doing what they're doing. I think so many things start with looking inward and being honest about what your intentions are and what you're hoping to get from it, what you are hoping will happen. If you are hoping that, people will enjoy this, they'll think it's funny, they'll laugh at me or support me, that's one thing. If you see that it's a part of joining with someone or supporting or a show of solidarity, that is a different thing. I do like Natasha's thought about communicating, asking people what they think. It can get tricky though. And I don't know if there's, a great answer for this, but it can get tricky because we don't want to put the onus or the burden on others and, ask them, teach me, tell me what I'm doing wrong. So I think it depends on the kind of relationship you have with the person. But I mean, so many of these things are, there's not a perfect answer, unfortunately. It's about being thoughtful. It's about being honest with yourself. And I think, it definitely does involve communication, being open.
And to your point, Dana, like maybe what I need to amend that to is like opening your eyes and being aware and beginning to kind of tune in to what the response is that you're getting without having to sort of come out and ask, like, what do you think? But like to just try to begin to gauge, like, what's the reaction I'm getting, and trying to err on the side of like, I'm going to be cautious here because like this is like fraught. This is a fraught part of our experience and of people of color's experience, and again, that goes back to the history of like, I was, without like getting too much into like a lecture here, but like that there is this whole history that again, like most Americans are not taught unless they are taught from within their families, that, like all of these forms of cultural appropriation have happened on like a kind of historically for the last 400 years, like, Black song, Black, all these different art forms have been like taken and then sold. I mean, Elvis Presley is the classic example, and they've always been condemned to some extent by, sort of white authorities who've seen how sort of threatening in some ways they are to the status quo, people who are putting forth segregation as like, are trying to maintain these more rigid racial hierarchies. But I guess what I'm getting at is like part of the reason that people are offended is because there's this history of things being taken by force from Black creators and then repackaged and resold for the benefit. And so it's like, but without that historical context that's kind of erased, it does create this sort of like ongoing ignorance that, in some ways is an ignorance by choice at this point,
Ignorance of privilege in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it also feels like profiting off of somebody's pain or their experience, and you get to reap the benefits of our practices without really understanding them or understanding any of the pain.
Yeah.
Yeah, Natasha, you made a really another really interesting point about what families teach their children, what they teach each other, and I think another way to sort of address the issue of cultural appropriation is to get more in touch with yourself and your own history, your own culture. And I know that white people sometimes feel like they don't have a history or a culture or race, but that's not true in many, many ways. There is ethnic white culture, and then there's American white culture. And I think it's a good idea to explore those things, because I think if people have like a firmer grounding within themselves and in their community, they already have something and don't need to take from somebody else in the same way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that that's so beautifully said. And, there's sort of a jokey, Michael Harriot is a tweeter, he's a journalist on Twitter. He's a tweeter. And, he just sort of said it funny because it kind of can cut both ways. And also we could just introduce a little humor into the conversation, because it is heavy. He tweeted the other day, "We love to talk about how Black America turned its pain into the blues, jazz, rock, and hip hop, only to have it co-opted by white America. But no one ever mentions the most offensive cultural appropriation, how Albert Einstein stole Frederick Douglass's hair." And I just think that's adorable, but also points to precisely what we're talking about. And the idea of, what is original and what isn't, and in terms of, can we have and create or reclaim or recreate our own origin story. I just was doing an interview actually with Dr. Michael Yellowbird about, he's an indigenous dean of a social work school, but also does a lot of, work and himself has done a million ways of looking at the ways in which the collectivist culture is inherently different from the individualistic Western culture around ways of healing and how that can happen. And he introduced me to a term called something about, it wasn't the care contract, but it was something along the lines of, actually, if you care and you're in community with someone, that makes a big difference to their healing. And that may or may not happen in a 45-minute session. It may be that you end up going to their house and that, it was citing a case study, I think, and it was Australia or New Zealand for an Aboriginal woman around, noticing the suicidality rates were really, really high, and that this person, essentially not a trained social worker or, psychotherapist or whatnot, was started to go into the homes of people and literally like have tea with them and sit with them and do the kinds of things that inherent to a lot of the more indigeneity within our own cultures, even if you're white, right? Like back in your Celtic or Welsh culture, there might have been some version of that. But as the whiteness has become more assimilative and Americanized over time, that gets dissipated, and then these looking out for some ways of healing, and not that there's everything wrong with Western psychotherapy. It's certainly a tool, but it's not the only tool. And I think, the last piece I want to say there is that we're trying to interrogate whiteness, as we said in the beginning, and white supremacy and things that get in the way and the things that heal. And Lama Rod Owens, who's a mindfulness practitioner that I really appreciate, was in the Washington Post the other day. And he said that mindfulness, as it's taught in the mainstream, will not be enough to undo trauma, racism, and so forth. Buddhist mindfulness is about liberation through cultivating awareness and ethics. For me, we have to bring ethics back into secular mindfulness. Ethics means that this is what is conducive to liberation, or another way of putting it is, this is what's conducive to the reduction of violence. This is what is conducive to actually beginning to undo systematic white supremacy. And appropriation is a part of that supremacist model. And so, I just think that we have to be willing to kind of look at this in different ways. And I know that, Lynn, you talked about in some of our show notes, Han, and how from your cultural perspective, that's something that also has a rich history, and would like to invite you to kind of share a little bit about that.
Sure. So I was going to go back and kind of, I was thinking through when you said some words that kind of just triggered me, and it's like little mind bubbles and like synapses are coming across.
Yeah.
And just to admit, like, this is really super uncomfortable because, yeah, I do feel like my privilege is being interrogated, and I'm like, okay, let's go at it. Like, what is this thing that I don't know of that might be adding on to the systematic, violence of the way things are done? And so a couple of that was when I was telling the story of like my high school, I didn't want Black soul because it was just, I mean, this is part of it. Yeah, they were the majority, right? Actually, that's why I want to be white, right? That's my privilege. Like, I'm in a white world. Like, God darn it, the way I'm going to survive is to identify with the oppressor. And if I'm good at it, then let me be, because that's how I'm going to survive, because when I come back home, it's like, are we going to pay rent this month? And it's like nose above water. Like, I'm not thinking, I didn't grow up with a mindset of like, systematically, how are we causing, it's like, like just try to survive. And the way to do that is to be like the ones that are ruling the whole damn thing. And that's white. And so I think that whiteness and survival is so embedded. And I think that's one of the reasons why when you talk to an Asian person, it's almost like you're letting them, like you're asking them to put their survival guards down. That's hard. First, you got to come to awareness of it. And there's a lot of defenses of that, but it's hard. And I think that's why they're like, what do you mean privilege? All I did was struggle to pay rent here. What are you talking about? Like it's so disconnected from them. That they might play into a systematic thing. So I think that's one thing that's, again, kind of like reminding me, wow, like there's just so much work for my people too, to come into awareness of, yeah, what is my rightful place and how do I add on to the systematic thought? But in my high school, it was more like a connection. Like when people say to me, like, you're like that Asian girl with the Black soul, it's because they don't know the Asian soul. What they're really saying is you have soul, right? And that was the primary expression of soul, was that it was Black. And so I wanted Black soul, but really what I really wanted was, I was tapping into like my cultural origins of Han too, right? When you think about, like, when I think about all the ways that I've looked up to Black soul or Black music, or it's all in the context of spirituality. My dad was a pastor, so I mean, church music was huge. And so I get it, like this like guttural noises to the unknown higher power of like, save us, when will you come for us? I mean, those are like, it's been forged in the sufferings of my people. And so, I understand that. And I think that was the draw. And so this word Han comes from, it's like it's an expression of anger, resentment, unfinished like angst and grief and despair. And it's a thing that a people feel, it's a collective angst, it's a collective sorrow. And it developed, usually when we talk about Han, we talk about the Japanese occupation, so it's interesting. I had sent Brian a little clip of a Korean guy. He's like, let me talk about cultural appropriation here. And halfway through the video, he's like, I understand why, why Koreans, or he's a Korean guy and he's giving a lecture in a Korean university. And he's like, yeah, why are they so sensitive? Like, I can't do anything without, like offending somebody, or playing into some stereotypes. And he kind of joins people with that. But then he like turns it around. Then he says, but what do y'all feel when you see this? And it's the picture of the rising sun. that flag, the symbol that Japanese people had. And it's funny because I was detached from that. I was looking at this like, what about it? As a second gen Korean American, I'm like, what about it? There's nothing to me in this, right? But he was saying, and I saw how the reaction of like the people that are watching it are going, oh no. And he was able to kind of draw in how like this is what we're talking about.
Well, the trauma, the intergenerational piece there. Yeah, and I think that that's really critical because, and because I'm going to have to leave the show a little bit early today, Natasha, thank you so much for being able to, sort of wrap up for the last 15 minutes. And I don't mean wrap up, I mean continue the conversation because we still have a substantial period of time. But just to sort of, say my piece as I'm sort of beginning to transition out, that this idea of the trauma, the intergenerational trauma, and someone earlier, Dana, it might have been you, mentioned the way in which the singing actually is somatically inclined, the way in which it's reverberating. And as someone who is a somatic psychotherapist and understands a little bit more about the nervous system and the neuroscience and the ways in which polyvagal theory and these other kinds of things influence how we are, and also the mirror neurons and the co-regulation and what it is to be in community. What are the manifestations of what collectivist culture is actually doing in terms of bringing in the healing in ways that aren't obvious to Western psychotherapists, but have been in existence for millennia in all of these various ways, out of some of the things you're talking about, like this this sense of angst around this cultural, piece, and how we also have the cultural somatic trauma, if we are white-bodied or light-skinned privileged, of colonization and enslavement and genocide, but it's inverted in a way, and it takes the form of the narcissistic, grandiose oppressor, which tends to be more, separated and aversive if we're using attachment language, and avoidant, as opposed to this more sort of engaged, more relational, secure attachment that you might find in a well-functioning collectivist group or society culturally, and doing a cultural somatic piece around it. So those are just some of the thoughts that I had, and perhaps you can dig into a little bit more of that. But before I go, I wanted to ask you if it would be okay with you for me to share a poem that I had written and shared with at least Lynn and Natasha read it. I don't know if you did, Dana, but I'm curious to know whether or not the reflections around this are in fact appropriative or not, or how it lands. Because I think that the way in which it was written based on my Haitian and Dominican and Italian American ancestry is authentic to my experience. But back to our earlier conversation about the asking or the checking or knowing or not knowing, and to whom is this poem satisfying and to whom might it be offensive? And it's not about trying to please all of the people all of the time, but at what degree to which we, as I did, use the poem as a way of processing my own trauma of having done this psychoanalytic webinar earlier in the day that really kind of I found quite offensive. And, reading these books by Fanny Brewster on racial complexes as a Jungian analyst, and really kind of understanding what the impact is of still using words and terms like primitive when it comes to the Negro American in Jungian analytic communities now, and why, not changing up that language within the academic institutions that are currently being taught is problematic, that out of that came this poem. And so I'd like to share it with you, maybe get a couple of quick reflections, and then unfortunately I'm going to have to Audi 5,000, but you guys can either reflect on it or do whatever you want for the rest of the time. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So, and I share this because we're talking about creativity, joy, because we're talking about what's generative out of what's disruptive. And this is what I generated. And I'm curious to know if it has created more generative and nutrient or more trauma and division. Anyway, it's called Stacked. They stacked black bodies into ships. The middle passage layered, 20 million people plucked and purchased. The remainder, half of them, lived. What remains is nuclear, whiteness, eternity's half-life. They stacked black bodies into trucks, dozens outside the funeral home in Brooklyn during COVID, 1,000 a day, brown and black people dying. I can't breathe. The weight of Eric Garner's words, portending George Floyd, bearing the weight of the knee, whiteness laid bare. Kaepernick takes a knee, un-American, which lives matter now? Black imprisoned men bury black bodies in the Potter's Field on Hart Island, hearts of people, Geechee, North Sea Islands, Hilton Head, Gula, West Africa, America. How many were thrown overboard for insurance money, still breathing? What unnameable aches lie silent, groaning, bellowing at the oceans, knowing? What claims sit centered within whiteness so silent? Reckoning, remorse, reconciliation so distant. The cost of this passage, more than 13 billion collected by a single white man in one pandemic day. Our consumption, insatiable, Amazonian, this particular appetite for privilege, defending manufactured liberties, whiteness's psychic abyss. When will we own the horror? How will we take it in, digest it? To risk drowning in truth arrests cooperation in the tacit complicity required of silence. These habituated ways of unseeing, so stealthy, our refusal to plumb such depths, as facile and relaxed as Chauvin's demeanor. Our assignment chiseling through, mining the layers of all that's complex within us, this endeavor or task, an unusually helpful fracking. We keep our shadows held inside so tightly, clinging to their benefits as Southern belles clutch their pearls. These shadowy remains remained stacked, so deep, layered within the bowels, still moaning, each one with its own voice yearning to rise up, still, each one relentless in its knocking, a persistent reminder. Having persevered this sacred excitement, having preserved this sacred excitement, both abundant and unsullied, these holy tremors await their ascension, forever eager to meet the light and to sing.
It's a powerful poem.
Yeah, I don't even quite have the words right now. I thought it was really beautiful in terms of talking about the different forms of pain that people of African descent have endured, both then and now, and also asking the question of when will there be like some accountability, some admission. So there's sort of a calling in there. And then I really liked the way that it ended. You know, there was some hope, you know, the idea of ascension. And it didn't just leave it at this place of pain or hopelessness, which I think happens a lot. It's really, I don't want to say easy, but it can happen that when we are experiencing or discussing trauma, we can really get inundated and buried in it. And that's part of it. We do have to get in touch with it, feel it, experience it, but that's not the end of it. There has to be some balance, and you know, having some time away from it, having some time to heal. And yes, again, part of healing is being in touch with it, but that's not the only thing. There's more to it. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, thank you.
Well,
Francesca, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I think it really was powerful, and I think it is offensive, and I think it should be. It arouses a lot of discomfort that's needed for disruption. You know, so I think in some ways we need more art forms that kind of can disrupt us in our little comfortable bubbles. Like the image of body stacking, that makes me very uncomfortable.
And it was happening around the corner in Flatbush.
Absolutely. You know? And the fact that like it's happening right around the corner, like you said, right? And that I'm okay, like should be a little uncomfortable. So I think sometimes it's just this acknowledgement that when we speak truth, you know, the ones that really matter will disrupt something. And so thank you that it is a little offensive.
Thank you for that. And to Natasha's point, and I'll turn it over to you, and I'll unfortunately have to move on as I have another engagement for self-care, is that Natasha, you talk a lot about cognitive dissonance, and perhaps that's part of what this can go into in terms of why that's our moral imperative, to go back perhaps to what Lama Rod was talking about in terms of, in that Washington Post article, the ethical component to undoing whiteness and collective liberation, and how perhaps these creative pieces can be part of that. So thank you so much again to our fearless producer, Brian. I'll turn it over to you all, and thank you, and I will see you all next week.
See you.
Thank you so much, Francesca. And I know that you have to leave, but and that she has to go, but I'll just say that I heard in that poem like a lot of kind of breaking denial, like really, trying to create, inescapable images that kind of tie things together in terms of the suffering that our society tolerates, and normalizes, that is mostly held by Black bodies, Black and brown bodies, and disproportionately Black and brown bodies, and that is like both traumatic, especially for people who have who are experiencing it directly and for whom that's experience near, and yet it's also, paradoxically necessary, in a lot of ways for people in positions of privilege to wake up. And I think that is a big I think contradiction in how we heal in this country, because people's needs, we're a very heterogeneous society, and the needs for healing are very heterogeneous. And the healing needs, the needs of kind of people from the dominant culture, like white people who make up many of the people who are in therapy. So like this sort of has to do with our role as therapists. you know you know White people get a lot of therapy, and yet healing from being white supremacist or being people who carry white supremacy and carry it out and are complicit with it is not a part of how we think about therapy and about healing. And yet, sometimes the way that it happens now is like the way that white people come into kind of healing is by making the trauma of white supremacy more obvious. And so like there's this thing that I've heard a lot of people express, like, why does it take death? Why does it take Black death? Why does it take, or why does it, it's sort of, like, and I think you could make the case for many different, ethnic groups within the United States. I mean, I think it's the most severe with African Americans, but I think you certainly could say, like, why does it take, these kind of like the atrocities at the border for people to wake up to the experiences of people who are undocumented or who have been undocumented at some point in their life? Like, why does it take that Asian man being dragged off the plane for people to wake up to the fact that there's discrimination against Asians, even though, like Asians are considered this model minority, like as if that. So, I think like breaking white denial, I think is really crucial within therapy, like that's a place that I see that it can happen more actively, and that it could, and that also that therapists, most of whom are still white, can take some of that burden, of, and be more active, and, can begin to sort of create more ways to kind of wake themselves and also their white patients up to the fact that a lot of times one of their coping mechanisms for maintaining this kind of white supremacy position is to make people of color and mostly African descended people take all of the emotion and to hold all of the affect, all of the not just the pain but the joy, and then deal with the fact that like you can't just take it. You have to begin to deal with the fact that you have a lack and you're looking for it. And that's why, you get these reactions back of like, well, you're culturally appropriating. Why? I just love, it, or I just want to be part of it. And Lynn, that's not at all a knock on you, because I think you're really being open. And I've been in the same position, like I've also, I mean, I also went to schools where I was in the minority, and most of the students were Black students and like wanted to fit in and wanted, and thinking back to, like how I used to love to say that I went through a whole phase in elementary school where I loved to say what? I mean, I'm kind of dating myself because it was like the late 70s, but like, like, I mean, I really in some ways was just like, wanted to be Black, partly to fit in, partly because it was cool, you know, without really taking in like the trauma that
Mhm.
grows out of. And yet also, you know, kind of feeling that on a deeper level, a lack within my own experience as like, and you know, it's like very obvious, I think, when you're surrounded by, you know, Black people that like, whoa, there's something like that's present and kind of desirable that I don't have. And yet it's like, right. And I also don't have to worry about like, you know, all of these, you know, other things that being Black is a part of, but I'm not dealing with that. And I, you know, was privileged enough to be in a city, Washington, D.C. in the 70s when like Black history was part of the curriculum. So I did have the privilege of learning from a young age, like this is what being Black means. And that education, I think, or what the Black experience in America is, and that I think was very, very, very helpful because it
Mhm.
really kind of like steeped me in more of like Black subjectivity, you know, and I don't want to always reduce things down to black and white. And it's interesting because like I would love to get a cohort together from my schools because there were Latino, Asian, you know, a lot, it was very mixed. And I would love to get a group together and talk about like what it was like and like what we think we gained from having this curriculum, which was very focused on Black history and really like
Mhm.
centered Black history and Black art and, you know, was imperfect, but also like you really got that as a child and it was very normalized and very kind of like
Mhm.
it's information, you know,
Mhm.
that people need to understand who they are as white people and non-Black. And, you know, if we could have that, if we can create that more within policy and within the culture, then a lot of these problems would be lessened because people would understand who they are and what they're doing.
Mm.
So anyway, uh that's all to say that like I think there's a lot for white therapists to do with white clients. And I think also like, you know, Black and brown therapists to the extent that it feels possible, you know, and I think that's another conversation that I'd
Mhm.
like to have at some point, like what, you know, working with white clients and
Mhm.
what feels possible. Because there's also a long history of writing that's been done by Black and brown therapists about working with the countertransference from white clients and how that, you
Mhm.
know, is you know, can be of course problematic, but also like can actually like be a tool to then kind of do work which by definition, you know, is both like healing but also anti-racist with white clients.
Mm.
And I mean, therapists of color have really led the way there. And
Mm.
yet, of course, again, we don't know the history because it never gets
Mm.
talked about.
So thank you so much for all of it. I mean, even just the space. I think what I'm realizing is, you know, so much more of this kind of graciousness and of space, like what Dana was saying in the beginning of like, where can we actually, where do we go? Where does the average person actually go to talk about stuff like this? And I think it's your graciousness and like the spaciousness that afforded me the courage to say, actually, if I think about it, it's this. Or like without that, I will hold on to my survival mechanisms. And what you know, I'm thinking back to like what I was talking with Francesca in my last conversation was like, the more Asians feel disempowered, the more they try to be white. Because
And I
that's what
think
they
that's an
know.
important
Yeah.
aspect of this is like the survival demands that
Yes. Yes.
people are under, which are very real.
Which are very
And
real. Mm-hmm.
we do have to wrap up. And Dana, I just want to kind of come back to you for you know, just to wrap up. And you know, I think, I mean, there's so much we could talk about, and we never really got to talk more about like cultural practices and sort of the healing aspect, which I think we're going to have to do like another show to focus specifically on that.
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder if there was anything sort of like that you felt like was that you still wanted to sort of say that was unsaid for you, or just like that, you know, like a sort of something that, you know, felt that was sort of maybe lingering for you that you just wanted to talk about briefly before we wrap up.
You know, I don't think so necessarily, because I think this conversation went the way that it was sort of meant to. It felt organic and we addressed things. sort of as they came up, and I think that, of course, we covered a lot and could continue, but I think, I like Lynn, really appreciate this space, and the chance to sort of examine ourselves and examine what is going on around us, and the chance to be sort of curious and like talk things through together, and sort of talk about some collective ideas for moving forward. Yeah, I mean, because the things we talk about are so complex. I think there are things that are unsaid, but at the same time, I think this was a really good, really powerful sort of starting point, if that makes sense. So I really appreciate it in a lot of ways. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to you both. This is Dana Collins and Lynn Min, therapists, both in the New York City area, who have been so gracious and so generous with their time today at Inside Out with Francesca and Natasha. And I just want to share with you both that you're more than welcome to come and talk with us anytime that you have time and interest in doing so. And I want to thank Brian Johnson for being our producer today, and to Solivity Live. Thank you for being our hosts. And, so much work to do, but it's good to connect with others doing the work and share ideas and also support with each other, because that's how we get it done. Thank you so much to both of you, and to Brian and to Francesca, who had to leave early, and see you next week.
Thank you for watching Inside Out with Natasha and Francesca here on Solivity TV every Wednesday at noon. Solivity Magazine brings you the best in inspiration on Solivity TV. Check out our new shows. Mark your calendars for Solivity Magazine shows by going to solivity.com/.